What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you something a little different. So, I'm actually a huge fan of Vampire The Masquerade Bloodlines. I actually still have that game installed on my computer to this day. So, as you've probably heard, Vampire The Masquerade Bloodlines 2 comes out next year in March. They don't have a specific date, by the way, it just says March, like everywhere I look, which I thought was a little strange, but, just a quick footnote. So, I've kind of been wanting to cover it, I just wasn't really sure where to start exactly, because it's kind of a game that I haven't really covered at any length in the past. So, a couple of days ago, they recently finally finished giving all the details on the clans of vampires and the factions that will be in the second game. So I figured going over those things is probably as good as I'm going to get. So that's where we're going to start. So we're taking a look at this stuff. So first thing I want to mention, clans have been slightly changed since Bloodlines. Not a lot, but enough to be noticeable. 2 are missing and 1 was added. First of all, the playable clans are not all of the clans. There are clans that you cannot play as if you're unfamiliar with the World of Darkness universe. So, the Gangrel clan, which was like the lone wolf types, have been removed completely. The Nosferatu have also been removed from playable clans. They are still in the game, however, that's been confirmed. I don't know if there's any Gangrel in Bloodlines 2, but they've also been removed. They have been not exactly replaced, but another, not exactly clan, but type of vampire was added, known as the Thinblood. So Thinblood isn't actually a clan of vampires, it's a type of vampires. Specifically, I believe the 15th and 16th generation. I might be a little off on my lore, it's been a little while, but I'm pretty sure that's correct. Basically, the newest generations of vampires are called Thinbloods, because they're so far removed from the original source of the power, which was the first vampire, Cain, that they're pretty weak, actually, in terms of, vampires. They're still stronger than pretty much any human. However, they're kind of known for their almost human abilities sometimes. In fact, it's not exactly proven, but plenty of times they are mentioned walking in the sun. There are legends of them eating regular food, and in some cases, even giving actual birth. Each clan that you can pick, or Thinblood, has a type, 3, what they call disciplines, which are basically just types of vampire powers that kind of differ from clan to clan. So when you pick a clan, it is actually an important choice because you are also picking your disciplines by default. So the 3 for Thinblood are Chiropteran, which is basically your affinity to bats, allowing you to move through the air, summon them. There is actually a guy in the original Bloodlines who turns into a giant bat. Now, you couldn't do that yourself in Bloodlines, but it's nice to see that they kind of added that type of thing to the second one. The second discipline is Mentalism. The Thinblood discipline allows the vampire to manipulate objects through telekinesis, which is pretty straightforward. And then Nebulation. The Thinblood calls on their affinity to mist, to summon and command it. So, pretty cool stuff. The Thinblood isn't new to the series, because there are some in Bloodlines, but they are new as a playable. So, I guess we'll find out. Coincidentally, one last thing I want to mention about Thinbloods real fast is that, typically speaking, they are left alone. They're usually not near a master who can teach them. They're usually lost, and most of them don't survive. Because being a Thinblood in the Bloodline, or the World of Darkness universe, rather, is not a good thing. You are very much so looked down upon. So, moving on to the Bruja. The Bruja are revolutionaries in most sense. So, as you can read from this little paragraph here, they're outcasts, they're pariahs, they're largely part of the Anarchs, which is a faction. It's their whole thing. The Bruja are, of course, from the original Bloodlines, and their discipline is Potence. This basically makes them super strong. Celerity, which makes them super fast, as you can read. A lot of really popular characters from Bloodlines were Bruja, notably Smiling Jack. He's probably the coolest character in that game, to be honest. But moving on to the Tremere. The Tremere are blood mages. They have learned to use their vampire blood to basically use magic. As you can read from this paragraph, they are mostly new to Seattle. Most of them haven't really been around here. They just kind of recently moved in, from what I have understanding of the plot line. And they also have access to two separate disciplines. Thaumaturgy, which is pretty much their blood powers. This is them commanding and manipulating the blood in other people and their own. And then Auspics, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. This is basically their ability to send their consciousness out, so to speak, like they can sense other people as well as project themselves, that kind of thing. So that's what makes the Tremere unique. If you're looking for a wizardy vampire, that's pretty much your Tremere. Anything to do with the occult is kind of their whole thing. And that brings us to the Toreador. So the Toreador are probably most of the vampires you would be familiar with in modern pop culture. So the Toreadors are basically artists. They are people with a passion. They're very much so involved in human society and the nightlife, that kind of thing, because that's their whole deal. They just really enjoy beauty and sharing it in all those ways and basically enjoying life for what it is. And they are probably the closest to humanity, and that's important. Their disciplines are presence, which is basically just their ability to it's almost like charisma for vampires, just their presence kind of elicits a reaction, so to speak. They also get celerity as well for their second discipline, and basically that just means they're faster, like I stated earlier. And that brings us to the Ventrue. The Ventrue are the ruling class. These are the guys who are like CEOs, that type of thing. They're usually the princes of an area, which are the rulers in the Camarilla hierarchy, which is, again, one of the factions. The Ventrue are pretty much leaders. That's their whole thing. In one way or another, they consider themselves the architects, like they're guiding vampire society, all that kind of stuff. The Ventrue are leaders. So their powers are, of course, dominate, which makes total sense. That's your ability to dominate other beings, which, is obviously a go-to for anyone in their line of life. So they also have fortitude, which is of course, increases their physical resilience. So this is their ability to outlast people, be stronger than them, and take hits. I don't know if they'll do it in this game, but just one quick aside, the Ventrue in the original game weren't allowed to feed on rats. And I mean that in you couldn't recover anything from them. Like you could actually do the act of getting blood from a rat, but it wouldn't help you at all, which I thought was adorable. And then, of course, we have the Malkavians. The Malkavians are known as eccentric, to say the least. Basically, these guys aren't even trusted by other vampires to be in charge of anything for the most part, because they're all, typically speaking, nut jobs. Now, it manifests itself in a variety of ways. A lot of them tend to be insane. Some of them not so much. Some of them can actually be fairly coherent and form thoughts, but almost all of them have some weird mind thing going on. So their disciplines are dementation, which, it dements people. That one seems pretty straightforward. And they, of course, get Auspics as well, which was the projections and stuff with the mind, which, of course, makes sense. Now, one quick just aside that I actually want to mention, that all of the clans in the original Bloodlines got 3 disciplines, whereas in this one, only the Thinblood does, which I find interesting because the Thinblood are largely considered lower class, so to speak, as far as vampires go. And the last thing I want to mention on the clans before we move on to factions is that all of the actual clans, not the Thinbloods, the actual clans, from what I understand, the name of their clan is the name of the original vampire from that clan. That's my understanding of it, at least. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's a thing. Now, switching over to the factions. So, starting with the Pioneers. I'm probably going to do a little more reading for this part because it's still kind of new. So we get these nice fancy pictures in the background, and then we get these little pluses that we click on for some information. A quote from their leader, Lou Grand. This little paragraph about what they're actually about. Basically, the pioneers are the vampires that were in Seattle basically from the beginning, and they've helped turn the city into the tech giant that it is today. And then, of course, we have this last little bit here kind of explaining who's part of it. Now, the Pioneers is a faction comprised of many other vampire clans. Like, there's no real, like, you have to be this vampire clan to enter. It was just the vampires that were there. So there's all sorts of professions as well as clans coming into the Pioneers. It's basically the people who settled and made Seattle. Then, of course, we have the Camarilla. The Camarilla is the obvious faction in Bloodlines 2. It was, of course, in Bloodlines 1, and it plays a major role in the entire universe of the World of Darkness. So the Camarilla is responsible for the Masquerade. The Masquerade being the rules vampires adhere to keep their presence hidden from mortals. Violations of the Masquerade, even if you aren't part of the Camarilla, are met with hit squads. They will try to kill you. It's their whole thing. Of course, a quote from Alec Cross. The important thing about this particular one is not just the name of the leader, but Alec Cross is the Prince of Seattle. He is the Camarilla's ground man in charge. He is in charge of everything Camarilla in the city of Seattle. Led by Prince Cross, they ingrain themselves into the corporate landscape of Seattle. So that's important to mention because the Camarilla wanted Seattle after it was made. The Pioneers made Seattle, if that makes sense. So obviously there's going to be some conflict there. And that brings us to the Baron. So the Baron is kind of the local leader of like a neighborhood. So you met a few Barons in the original Bloodline, Jeanette and her sister, and then of course Tourette, which I won't explain to people who haven't played that game. It's a huge plot point. And then a couple other ones whose names, honestly, I don't remember. Like, I remember their faces and everything, but not their actual names. So the Baron tries to stay off the grid. He basically gets everyone who can to work for him and give them favors. This guy's like the underhanded dealer faction. Seems to really know who the Baron actually is. Like, some people have supposedly met him, but for the most part, no one does. And he's simply referred to as the Baron. Which is cool, because I think there's a lot of, mystery involving this guy. But basically, the Baron is like a mob boss, kind of seems to be the general gist of things. Basically, anything uncouth and morally questionable, even for vampires, seems to be what the Baron is into. I think mob boss probably seems to describe it the best. And then that, of course, brings us to the newcomers. The newcomers are outcasts, mostly Tremere. I guess we'll see how that plays into, other clans, but pretty much the Tremere form the outcasts. They basically showed up, established the university district, and that's just kind of what they're in charge of. No one seems to have contested that for some reason. The Tremere operate in a hierarchy they call the pyramid, which is basically like scholarly levels, if you will, and the guy at the top of the pyramid is the important one. It says right here in this that the Baron and the outcasts are at a bit of an odds with each other because the Tremere are very private in what they do. So I'd be interested. The way it worked in the original one is that if you wanted to be part of the Tremere faction, if you will, you basically had to be a Tremere. It was like its own separate thing you could do if you were a Tremere vampire. So I'm thinking this might wind up being something similar. But I'm curious if they'll let another clan work for them in like a lesser capacity. So I guess we'll see how that plays out. And then of course, the Tremere are academics, so it makes sense that they would take the university district because like that's their whole thing. They're scholars and they want to learn more and more so they can come up with more blood magic and things like that. And then last but not least, we have the Unseen. The Unseen seem to be a Nosferatu exclusive faction, which is interesting to me because you can't play Nosferatu in this game. So the Unnoticed are basically the people who have been homeless, the outcasts, the fringes of society, the downtrodden, the poor, and the Nosferatu have been just kind of hanging out with them. That said, they trade in secrets. Hacking is a big thing with them. Any way they can get information is what they do. Nobody likes the unseen, but everyone needs them, which is kind of the Nosferatu's whole thing, so it makes sense that that's what they are. I'd be curious if this is a faction you could actually work for, how that's going to work. Because the Nosferatu themselves don't really seem to care much about if you are or are not a Nosferatu. There are definitely some of them that don't like you if you're not Nosferatu, because, then you don't have a jacked up face. But that said, at least in the original game, there wasn't like a problem with you helping out the Nosferatu. So I guess we'll see how it works with them being like their own faction now. The interesting thing about them, though, is that the Unseen are very tight-knit, as it says right here. The Nosferatu are very much so protective of each other, and the underground, sewers, all that stuff, that is their game, that is where they control. So there you go, guys. That is a quick look at all of the clans and factions coming in Vampire The Masquerade Bloodlines 2. I hope you enjoyed the look at everything. If you did, I certainly hope you like, comment, and subscribe. Any of those things would be great. And lastly, I hope you guys consider joining my membership program. For just $1, you get a bunch of perks. It helps me out tremendously with the channel, so I hope you consider it. But either way, hope you have a great day. Thanks for watching.